Welcome to the Reddit realm. Today, we're diving into one of the eeriest and most chilling threads on the internet. People who knew murderers. When did you realize something was off? These first-hand stories will make you question just how well you really know the people around you. Let's get into it. Story 1. My bio dad ended up murdering my stepmom. Everyone in my family, my mom, and two older brothers definitely knew that something was up. He had severe anger issues and was very abusive. Some of the earlier memories I have are of him choking one of my brothers. He even almost choked my mom to death a couple of times. Obviously, my mom was smart and divorced him as he didn't want to see him kill my brothers. Years later, I come home from school and my mom and stepdad take us all to the side and tell us he shot our stepmom and was currently in jail. None of us were surprised. If anything, I was just so grateful my mom left him. It's so strange that I am directly related to a murderer. Story 2. The murderer I know was more of an acquaintance or casual friend. He lived down the hall from me and we hung out sometimes, but not like just the two of us. Still, we'd chill at each other's place regularly. I passed him one day in the stairwell, and I said hi. He said hi back, but called me by the wrong name. He was really distracted and kind of awkward. He didn't make eye contact and kept moving. I remember thinking maybe we don't know each other as well as I thought. Later, he was playing Nintendo. Yep, my N64. This was a while ago, with my roommate when I came home. He apologized and said his mind was elsewhere. A couple days later, there were cops all over the building, interviewing people and searching his place. They'd found the guy's roommate with a bullet in the back of his head in an abandoned lot across town. The next day, he confessed. Story 3. Never. He was a seemingly happy kid who brought a backpack full of probably stolen SNES games over to my place pretty regularly. The last time I posted this, I said he killed another teen in a drug-related turf war. I looked up his case afterwards, and it was actually 2. Story 4. A great-uncle shot one of my great-great-uncles for trying to fondle, or rape, another family member. Turns out everybody was tired of his shit, so the killing was never reported. Nobody quite knows where the body is buried, but my guess is that he threw it into the river. We were a dictatorship at the time, so seeing bodies flushed down the river was not uncommon. Story 5. Had an employee on my work crew, acted strange and wouldn't listen to direction, had goofy huge sideburns, ended up going to jail for a short time. When he got out, he shot his girlfriend and her parents. Story 6. I never suspected a thing. She was the nicest woman. I even let her babysit my cousin when I had custody of him for a little while. She was my neighbor, couple houses down, and everyone loved her. She grew gigantic pumpkins, was always outside, so everyone interacted with her a lot. I moved away and a few years later and was shocked to hear everything from my family and friends who still loved in the area. The story? She was married to a man. I knew him from my time living there too. One day, he was just gone. She was all beaten up. She said he beat her up. We always suspected this happened before this incident, and had left her because he got a woman pregnant a few towns over. We never heard from him again, but didn't really have a reason to. She would mention every once in a while that he was still harassing her, and was even beat up on another occasion after his disappearance. He was self-employed and didn't really have any family. No one suspected anything. 3 years later, she was dating another man. While dating this man, the police had been investigating her for stealing money from the grocery store she worked at. They went to the boyfriend's cabin, where they both were, to arrest her. She came to the door, said, "Okay, let me go put on some clothes." The police waited at the door. I obviously wasn't here for this part, so this is what I hear. The police then hear 2 gunshots. They run inside, and she had poured gasoline and set the house on fire, then shot her dog, then herself. It took some time to get the house fire under control. Once they did, and began investigating, they found another body in the basement that didn't die in the fire, but several days earlier. The body in the basement was her boyfriend. Then they began investigating further, and found a blue 55-gallon drum in her backyard that contained her husband. So she killed 2 people and her dog, and all she was suspected of was stealing from the grocery store. Edited to clarify that the body in the basement was the boyfriend, and to correct the time frame between the husband's disappearance and her dating the boyfriend. I fact-checked with the news article. I was way off on the time frame originally. Story 7. I worked at a box store about 20 years ago. A guy I worked with was always off and would give away pocket knives to other employees. One day, he came in with scratches all over his face. He had raped and murdered a disabled girl the day before, using a pocket knife he had given our coworker later that day. Story 8. I moved to a new town when I was 19 and was making new friends at my new job. I met this girl at work, and she invited me over to hang out with her and her best friend. I went, and the best friend's boyfriend was there, and the vibes were way off. I was uncomfortable. He was cold, and just seemed angry for no reason. They had mentioned to me before he got there that he was always controlling and had hit the girl before. Turns out, controlling was an understatement. She came home one day, and he was digging a hole in the backyard, and she asked what he was doing, and he replied, "Digging your grave." He hit her, said, if he can't have her, nobody could have her, all of that. So eventually she left him and had to get a restraining order and everything. He somehow persuaded her to get in a car with him on her work break, and they went missing for a few days. Turns out he stabbed her to death, threw her in a river, and killed himself. I met the girl only a few times, and him only the once, but the face that I was in such close proximity to someone capable of that gives me chills. She was so young, it was really sad. Story 9. Honestly, this girl I went to school with killed 2 kids she babysat and their mother. Before that, I would have told you she was one of the calmest, coolest people in our school. Would have never suspected her to do something like that. Story 10. The first time I met him. Jose was a friend of my ex, and something immediately seemed off. He was sneaky, always lying and cheating, but not good at it because he was dumb, and a total narcissist as well. I told my ex to keep his distance, that Jose would only get him into some shit. Not only did he set my ex up to be robbed, Jose snitched on a bunch of other people, and finally snapped on Stranger in a fit of roid rage and stabbed him. The guy he killed was fairly young and a good kid, just in the wrong place at the time. I hope that asshole rots in prison. Story 11. When he said there was. A teenager, his mother and his stepfather lived around the corner from me. My mother knew them better than myself, but we all thought they were lovely. A couple of years ago, the son went to the hospital several times asking for help. He claimed he had voices telling him to kill his stepfather, but each time he went, he was released and told to come back. They would give an appointment. A few weeks later, during a small argument, he stabbed his stepfather to death in the front garden. He turned himself in the next day and wasn't convicted as he sought help before it happened. Instead, he got the treatment he needed. Story 12. There was a kid I went to high school with who always gave me the creeps. We had a lot of mutual friends, so we always ended up hanging out, and it always made me feel really uncomfortable. Our senior year, he got suspended for like a week because someone had found and turned in a hit list he had made. No one really took it too seriously. About 3 years after we graduated, he was in the news for murdering a man in our town that he barely knew. He told the police that he held the man's eyes open so he could watch his life leave his body. Story 13. I didn't. He was the sweetest, kindest, gentle giant kind of guy. Kind of a weirdo, but still a great guy overall. I remember once that he shed a tear just by talking about his kid, because he was so filled with emotion from having him in his life. He turned out to kill his wife, kidnap his child, start the longest Amber Alert in the history of Canada. As he tried escaping to a different province, he killed another man to steal his car. I'm still unsure today if I should have seen anything at any point. It comes to haunt my nightmares from time to time. Story 14. Kid I went to school with from 5th to 8th grade. He was always a dick. Typical class clown, but with a mean streak. When we hit middle school, he was always making comments about to girls that were incredibly inappropriate. I never liked him and hated being around him. He ended up getting into meth and shot his mom and dad in their sleep while high. His mom died and his dad survived but was severely injured. Last I heard, he was crying crocodile tears, saying he regrets everything and wants another chance. But knowing him, it's total bullshit. He deserves to rot. Story 15. I've worked with 3 murderers in my job role supporting people with disabilities. All 3 had varying degrees of learning disabilities, and honestly, only for one of them did I know something was up. He worked out a plea deal as his disability meant that he appeared to lack mens rea and fitness to plead. It was as I was taking him home after all of the investigation was over, he turned to me and said, "Don't tell my wife about this." It was at that exact moment I knew he knew what he'd done. The other two incidents, one was so traumatized by what she'd done that she never recovered. She'd been in prison for 25 years and was broken when she came out. The last was a couple. Another vulnerable adult had gone missing. They even helped with the search teams. They were in bits, really concerned for the welfare of their friend, went on TV for an appeal for her to come home. She was under their bed the whole time. Story 16. Not my experience, but my grandmother's. She got pregnant at 15 by my grandfather and had to get married, 1960s. He was extremely abusive, and my grandmother went to the police multiple times because she felt like he would wind up killing someone, but they just didn't take it seriously and ignored her. He later went on to strangle and beat a 14-year-old girl to death with a baseball bat just a couple years later. Story 17. It probably doesn't actually count, but I want to tell someone about this anyway. We, partner and I, had some neighbors move in across the street, a young couple in their 30s. The guy would come over almost every day to chat with my partner. My partner told me he would say things about being raped by his brother as a kid and that people didn't care about him. His wife was weird. She just sat on the porch not talking to anyone or doing anything. Just sitting there. All I knew about her was she didn't have custody of her kids. A few months ago, our street was filled with cop cars and ambulances. Being the nosy cunts we are, we just watched out the window for hours as cops busted down the door, fucked with the couple's lawnmower, and eventually we watched as two body bags were loaded up into a vehicle right in front of our house. Turned out they'd killed themselves. Or, I guess one killed both of them with consent. They turned the lawnmower on in their house and died from the fumes. Their dog died too. My partner and I felt so bad for them because the landlord dumped their stuff into the street the day after, and only one person came by, grieving. We also felt angry at them for killing their dog. I tried finding the obituaries but couldn't. Months after this happened, I was on Reddit and saw a video, unrelated, of a man beating the shit out of a registered sex offender who was talking to his daughter. I went to Family Watchdog just to see, and guess whose mugshot came up? It was her, the wife. And she had a different last name than I thought she did, so I Googled her name to see if she got an obituary. She did. There was also a news article about how she and her ex-husband raped all three of their own kids and only spent 4 years in jail. The man who did it with her is still out there somewhere. I knew she was weird, but damn, we didn't feel as bad for them anymore. So yeah, that was an emotional roller coaster. Story 18. I went through primary and high school with a guy in the year below me who seemed a little distant. We lived near each other and caught the bus from the same stop. He was a bit of a bully, but it was something more. Like you could tell he wasn't a bully because he was hurting inside or because he felt threatened in some way. He was a bully because he did what he wanted to do and didn't realize that it hurt other people. Like the kind of kid who enjoyed pulling wings off flies. Not long after I left my hometown, I heard that he had been charged with the murder of a 2-year-old. Apparently, his girlfriend at the time left her daughter with him for an hour or so while she ran an errand. He couldn't deal with the toddler crying anymore, so he beat her. He caused severe internal bleeding, and she died in hospital not long after. He would have been around 22 when he did it. He was sentenced to 36 years with a non-parole period of 27 years. Story 19. Obligatory didn't know him as a friend, but a regular customer in my shop. He would come in after his shift to buy beer and tobacco. On one occasion, he caught and helped us to evict a shoplifter. He seemed friendly enough. Then a local girl went missing and was eventually pulled out of a river a few weeks later. They announced they were looking for somebody in connection with her death, and it was him. They had CCTV footage of him tailing her through a park and footage of him buying beer in a shop, still unconfirmed to this day being our shop as they blurred out the surroundings. Anyway, as we had a TV in our shop switched to the news channel as it was a rolling story local to us, we started to discuss the guy. If we saw him on the day she went missing, that kind of thing. We hadn't, but it was at that point when one of my staff, a young girl who had previously said to management that she didn't want to work the closing shift anymore because there was too many creepy men around, told us that he used to stare at her when he came into the store, in a way that made her uncomfortable enough to not want to be on the floor when he came in. They never got to question him about the murder as he was found dead in a local park a few days later. He'd hung himself. Story 20. I knew this kid my entire life. We were friends in elementary and middle school. More middle school. He was your typical redneck kid but a kind person. Imagine if Pinky from Pinky, and the brain grew up in the rural South. Well, as people do in school, we drifted apart. He honestly wasn't the person in the group I was friends with, he was just in that circle. So, we went about our lives. A year after we graduated in the same town we all grew up in, he killed his entire family. Mother, brother, stepsister, father. Just for no reason. Nothing really provoked him from my understanding. He left and went to ride ATVs with his friend later that day. They caught him, and he had no memory of it. He went to court and got life, and never could recount a single moment, at least he said. It was weird seeing this kid who was, to your knowledge, just dumber than a bag of hammers, yet a odd innocence to him, on trail for such atrocities. He just sat stone-faced the entire time, almost like he didn't understand what had happened. Not to say I felt bad for him, but I felt something. Sadness, perhaps. Story 21. Had a friend who, for some reason unknown, stopped taking his medication. I think it was for bipolar schizophrenia. Anyways, he ended up stabbing his mom and little sister to death and drinking their blood. Later, after he had been arrested, they found him eating and drinking his own feces and fluids, babbling about how their menstrual blood sustained him. He got back on medication, and the state said he was mentally fit for trial, and they convicted him. I don't even remember for how long. I thought the entire situation was wrong. It's kind of crazy how 1 month you know someone and they're just normal, laughing and living their life, and the next, they're doing something terrible. Story 22. I went to the same high school as the chick who gained infamy in the US for convincing her boyfriend to kill himself and then running all these charity events for him before getting caught. The text messages were public record and absolutely chilling. I think she ended up getting off with manslaughter, but the case is being appealed and will likely go to the Supreme Court. She was extremely forgettable in high school. Nothing remarkable whatsoever. Story 23. While I was in college, I worked in the bookstore over the summers. I worked with a guy there who was a decent guy, but always a little weird. He'd make inappropriate comments about some of the students that would come in for books, etc., but seemed harmless. He ended up being charged for attempted murder after stabbing his wife multiple times. I believe an affair was involved. The only reason the poor women lived was because a construction worker saw the attack and intervened. So shout out to that guy for having balls of steel. Story 24. My ex-coworker was always a huge dick who nobody liked to work with. He'd always be on his phone and talking to someone, even when he had a customer waiting to order in the drive-thru. The moment I knew he had something wrong with him was when I caught him looking for his dab pen in one of the lockers in the back room. He always used a top locker, but he was searching through one at the bottom, which happened to be my locker for the day. I told him that, so he just stared me in the face for a second and walked away. Later that same year, I learned that he shot and killed someone at a gas station. Story 25. Looking back, I should have known immediately, but I didn't even know what I was seeing. In 2016, I was working as a server, and one of my coworkers was always complaining about her shitty husband and how they always fought. They were from Chicago and kind of just always loud and aggressive, so I didn't think much of it. One night, they both came in for dinner and drinks and sat in my section, and I was looking forward to finally meeting her husband so I could give him a face. I just remember not being able to look him in the eye, feeling super uncomfortable anytime I needed to go over to their table, because my friend would try to spark convo, and I wanted to talk to her. But the guy's presence just sitting there would make my skin crawl. They left that night, but soon she stopped coming to work, and then, a couple weeks later, news broke about the murder-suicide, husband being the murderer. It was heartbreaking, and I no longer take lightly word of domestic disputes. Story 26. Well-attempted murderer. He attacked his dad with a hammer. He was one of my best friends growing up. I couldn't see it, but my parents did. They always said something seemed off. I only began to see it in my early 20s. There was just something off behind his eyes. He was very impulsive and keen to take big risks. Last I heard, he's in the state mental hospital indefinitely. Story 27. Sat next to him in choir class. He was always kind of off. He operated on his own wavelength, constantly in his own world, never really engaging with anybody. People just didn't really exist on his radar. On a class trip, we slept in the same hotel room, and he walked around naked like I wasn't even there. I always assumed he was autistic, but in hindsight, it might have been something much worse, like schizophrenia. He never seemed violent, but nobody ever talked to him enough to ever make that conclusion in the first place. A few months ago, he beat and stabbed his mother to death with a kitchen knife. It was so bad, dental records were needed to identify the body. He cut off one of her breasts and implied in his confession that he ate part of it. He waited until his dad came home from work to show him what he'd done. Claimed he saw a sign from the devil that told him to kill her. That may have been a lie. From what I heard, he was very excited to tell the police what he had done. And from what I do know about him, he might have said it for the attention. He turned himself in, waived his Miranda rights, and confessed to everything. When the cops found him, he was literally soaked in blood. He refused to shower it off, so they had to hose him down before they put him in a cell. He's looking at 40 years in prison. His mom was an amazing woman. She tailored our suits for choir and was constantly volunteering. If there was an event, she was there. She was going to be her town's councilwoman next year. She loved her son very much. She didn't deserve to die like that. Story 28. I have a friend's friend who, you know the drill. And they didn't know. They had no idea. Normal day with coworkers. Where's Stephanie? She didn't show up for like 4 days straight. Doesn't matter, work, speak with coworkers. Suddenly, police bursts in and arrest one of her coworker, another woman who killed Stephanie over work disagreement, dismembered the body to hide it, and went back to work like nothing happened. She walked out handcuffed and was convicted. Story 29. Unfortunately, I know a few people who have committed murder. The one I knew was crazy from an early age was a guy we call Biggie in the neighborhood. He was always crazy. He legit thought he served in the deep jungles of Vietnam. He was like 2 when it ended. Maybe 5 years ago, he went to some rehabilitation jail for killing a bunch of dogs, and they let him out on a day pass. He didn't return, and he beat a well-known gay activist to death at a bar that night. He's been released since then, and he lives back at his parents' house. I know for a fact he will do this again. Story 30. There was this guy who stabbed a young brunette woman 37 times and then raped her post-mortem. It turned to a cold case for 9 years. They finally caught the guy a couple years ago. Crazy thing was, I, a young brunette woman, worked next door to the bar where this guy drank every night. I also was a raging alcoholic and got blacked out drunk and walked home from there on and off nights regularly, almost every night. Almost 2 years sober now, thank God. However, I knew something was off about this guy the minute I laid eyes on him. I read people like a MF, and I just knew he wasn't someone to know. I talked to everyone who frequented that bar, but I never had a single conversation with him. And if I was out on a smoke break while he was outside, I just never felt like I could turn my back on him. When they arrested him due to one of his relatives adding their DNA to a genetic testing site, I straight up got chills down my spine for the first time in my life. Crazy thing was, I wasn't surprised. I was just surprised I knew from the minute I saw him. And that's it for today's eerie and unsettling stories. It's terrifying to think that we might cross paths with people capable of such horrifying acts and never even realize it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark side of human nature, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, you never really know what someone is capable of. See you in the next one.